Boxing Truth here. I had to talk a little bit about Triple G, Gennady Golovkin, the second most talked about fighter during fight week of Canelo Alvarez and Amir Khan, when a lot of the media questions addressed to Canelo were mostly about Triple G. Now, Triple G did an interview recently in his native tongue. I assume it's Russian. And it's been very few interviews where we got to see Triple G do interviews in his native tongue, and it's been translated for the American boxing public to be able to read. And it was a very interesting interview. And when he does an interview in his native tongue and it's translated and you read it, you see a different side of Triple G. You see the intelligent side of him. You see the business side of him. He understands what he's doing. He knows the game of boxing. He knows the politics. He understands the criticism that's being thrown at him. And it's always good to see the different side of Triple G, because when he speaks in English, which is pretty much his fourth language, we can't get to see the side of him. We can't get to see the serious side, and how much of a businessman and a smart negotiator and smart fighter that he really is. He's not your typical fighter, a guy that can't read, a guy that's stupid that makes dumb business decisions. The guy knows what he's doing. He's got his own promotional company that he's trying to upstart, looking to sign young fighters from the former Soviet Union in order to help those guys become the type of star that he is. Now, Triple G, in this very interesting interview, went over a lot of aspects of his career. Mainly, he went in on his rivals, pretty much trashed a lot of them, talking about that Canelo and HBO needed his name during the festivities of Fight Week to promote the fight between Canelo and Khan, because ticket sales for that fight were not going very well. They were unable to sell out the T-Mobile Arena, which holds about 20,000 seats. About 16,000 tickets were sold. And GGG, he knew that HBO and Canelo were using his name to promote that fight with Khan because it was struggling at the box office in order to sell out. And he pretty much talked about how a lot of fighters in the game, especially around his weight class, his rivals, a lot of fighters that call him out, they show a lot of bravado when the cameras and lights and cameras action are on, but once they're behind closed doors, once it's behind the scenes, not many guys are willing to fight. Now, when it comes to the criticism of his opponents, a lot of people saying that he's fought weak-ass opposition and the resume ain't as strong. But Golovkin does have a good argument. He says that, yes, the opposition ain't as strong, but what the fans must take into consideration is that I fought these guys when they were at the peak of their careers. And it's very true. Triple G has fought guys that were having a lot of momentum going into the fight. We're at the peak of the height of their powers. I mean, David Lemieux just came off winning a world title and fought Triple G. Gabriel Rosado was on a winning streak, was winning fights, was put himself in the position as a mandatory challenger for an organization belt at the 154-pound weight class before he fought Triple G. But he decided to not take a shot, not take his mandatory shot at 54, and instead move up in weight to middleweight for a much bigger opportunity against a star fighter like Triple G and a much bigger money opportunity, which is why he took the fight and got his ass whooped. But it was a bigger opportunity. That's why he took the fight. Now, Triple G, he went in on pretty much a lot of his rivals, called Canelo a welterweight cherry picker. That he could trash his opposition and all that, but at least he's not forcing welterweights to come up to fight him. I mean, imagine had Gennady fought a welterweight in one of his fights. Imagine how much the fans would have ripped him for picking on guys who are much smaller than him. And this is the dilemma about Triple G. Even though a lot of his haters say he's overrated, he's knocked out a bunch of bombs and no hopers, they hold him to a different standard. They want him to move up 2 divisions to fight light heavyweights to prove his worth. It just shows you that subconsciously they see Gennady as a big threat to a lot of people at around his weight class. That he truly is one of the premier fighters in boxing today. Even though they say he's knocked out bums, they hold him to a much higher standard. In Canelo, he's held to a different standard compared to a Triple G. It's okay for Canelo to fight welterweights because he's a much more beatable guy compared to a fighter like a Triple G, who would be ripped a new one had he been feasting on welterweights or undersized guys for the majority of his career. He's been fighting real middleweights, something Canelo has not, which he says it's interesting that he even holds this strap, considering he hasn't even fought any real middleweights. He also talked about Billy Joe Saunders and that he's not really showing that he understands the sport of boxing by insisting that if they were to fight, that it should be on an undercard of a Fury-Klitschko rematch. Now, this was very interesting. I mean, Golovkin pretty much just told Billy Joe Saunders that he don't know shit about the boxing business and that he's at a level where he's the big drama show. He ain't fighting on nobody's undercards. And that if he truly wants a fight with Triple G, he will stop talking about fighting on undercards and maybe consider going to the United States where possibly more money could be made. But Triple G has insisted that he has no problem fighting Saunders in the United Kingdom. He has no problem going to England to fight him, as long as Saunders understands the business of boxing and quit talking that nonsense of fighting on the undercard. It will be their own main event. So Saunders needs to understand that Golovkin ain't fighting on no undercards, that it will be their own main event. He shitted on Carl Frosch, saying that he's pussy whipped, that his pretty wife makes his business decisions. Carl Frosch pretty much called out Triple G, says he's too big, too strong for him, and then a week later decided to retire. Perhaps envisioning that a brutal beatdown at the hands of Triple G had he decided to go on with that fight before he retired. And the Chavez Jr. fight also came about, which is a fight that Tom Loeffler, Gennady Golovkin, the team should just stop talking about. I do not need to see Chavez Jr. fight Triple G. I don't want to see that fight. It was interesting when Chavez Jr. was with Top Rank at the time, when he was actually, still an active fighter, still has some marketability, and was still considered one of the top fighters at around the middleweight, super middleweight divisions. It's just another slaughter type of a fight. Chavez Jr. is done. I mean, the guy looked like trash his last fight. He's been fighting at catch weights, can't even make the super middleweight division. Was fat as hell. That's why he pulled out of his last fight against Badu Jack. That ship has sailed. Tom Loeffler and Gennady should move on from that fight, but Chavez keeps insisting he wants to fight Triple G. Keeps talking shit. And for some strange reason, Loeffler and Golovkin are still somewhat interested in the fight. And Gennady did say that they have talked about it, they have met, and that the fight is possible for some time in the future. I really don't need to see that fight. I don't need to see Gennady slaughter Chavez Jr. There's really no point of the fight unless it makes business sense, which I don't understand why it still does. Everybody knows who's going to win the fight. Chavez Jr. is not a serious prize fighter anymore. So there's just no point of that fight even being made. I don't see why anybody would have any interest in watching that fight other than the fact that people want to see Chavez Jr. get his ass whooped. That's the only reason I think people would want to see that fight. When it comes to other prospective opponents in the middleweight division, he stated that Daniel Jacobs is a fight he would love to make, but that his team has been very quiet. Been very quiet in their pursuits of a possible showdown with Gennady Golovkin, so Golovkin's not really too confident that fight could be made. Even if the negotiations with Canelo don't work out and say the WBA enforces the mandatory shot with Danny Jacobs, a lot of people in the industry predict and speculate that even if that happens, Danny Jacobs is not going to fight Triple G, and then Al Heyman may advise Danny Jacobs to relinquish the belt and go another direction, similar to what he made Peter Quillen do, which would have been a career-high payday at that time, relinquishing his belt instead of fighting Matt Korobov and then going into another direction. But that's what's just being speculated. It'll make Danny Jacobs look like a complete bitch if he was to do that, not willing to take the mandatory shot, his mandatory shot against Golovkin to unify the WBA belts. But according to Golovkin, there's been no noise being made about Daniel Jacobs wanting to fight Triple G. No advances from his team, no negotiations, no talk. So it doesn't seem like that fight is even going to happen, even if the WBA enforces the mandatory. He even talked a little bit about Erislandy Lara, who keeps calling him out. But to Golovkin, it's just mere promotion on Lara's part, trying to remind the boxing public of who he is and not really willing to make a serious pursuit in trying to fight Golovkin. That Lara is just simply using his name in order to build his shit up, since his team and Lara himself have not made any advances or any serious pursuit of fighting Gennady Golovkin. So that fight really, it doesn't matter, because Lara and his team just doesn't, all they do is call Triple G out. They don't make any advances in trying to make the fight. And instead, Lara just limits himself by calling at Triple G out after he has fights signed, and then fighting pointless rematches against Vanes Martirosyan. A fight nobody wants to see. Nobody's talking about it because nobody fucking cares. Either he fights pointless rematches or faded guys, faded welterweights coming up. So Lara has done jack shit ever since his close fight with Canelo Alvarez. Feasted on hand-picked opposition, even worse than what many people say is a trash resume in Gennady Golovkin's. But Golovkin's been fighting champions, contenders, and top 10 middleweights, while Lara has been fighting faded no-hopers. So there you go. Don't need to see Lara get his ass whooped by Golovkin anyways. How about he do something of significance in the 54-pound division, or move his ass up to fight one of the fighters in the Al Heyman stable in Danny Jacobs. But I guess nobody wants to make that fight happen. And lastly, when it comes to Andre Ward, he didn't say anything about Andre Ward. The feeling is mutual between the two. Whenever you bring up Andre Ward, whenever you bring up Triple G to Andre Ward doesn't want to talk about Little G. Well, the same applies with Gennady Golovkin. He has no interest in talking about Andre Ward. Feels that he's shown his true colors, he's shown his demeanor, and that he insists that he just wants to insult Triple G and make false accusations that Golovkin ducked him, even though he already had a fight signed when Ward offered that weak-ass offer to fight Triple G last year. But like Lara, like many others, Andre Ward used Golovkin's name in order to promote his career, to promote his next fight. So Golovkin's name is being used for promotional purposes, for featuring a lot of fighters. His name's being used to promote events, promote guys' next fights. But when it comes to actually fighting Golovkin, a lot of guys say the right things or be amped up in front of the cameras. We don't fuck around. We don't fear nobody. But when it comes to behind closed doors, none of these guys are willing to fight. None of these guys are willing to put it on the line. They have other options or easier options with still decent paydays to be made, other than taking a big risk and taking a damaging loss to Triple G. So Golovkin is just going to wait and see what happens with the negotiations, but insist to the boxing public that the agreement doesn't come to fruition, that it won't be his fault. However, Golovkin needs to compromise a little bit. He is the B-side in this equation against Canelo, and most likely the fight will not happen next. Most likely Canelo will offer Triple G a fight down the line, but an interim fight in between, maybe two even. But Golovkin will have to compromise. He needs to forget about hopefully they can make a deal, because if it goes to a purse bid, Golovkin will be entitled to 45% of the purse, but that's not going to happen because Canelo is a much bigger draw compared to Triple G in terms of pay-per-views. And when it comes to a fighter who has a big draw, a big market value, it offsets those numbers. So it's important that they come to terms, and Golovkin's going to have to bend a little. May even have to agree to a catch weight, even though Canelo's already insisted he'll fight him at 160. But it is what it is. I'm just saying that, Golovkin needs to do what some other fighters before him did in order to get the big fight, and that's compromise just a little. He can't make any demands on money. That's not something he could do. He can negotiate, but not something where he's going to feel that he's entitled to 45%. That's just not going to happen. He can demand that the fight be at 160 for sure, considering the rules and that he's the mandatory challenger. And he wants Canelo to respect boxing, respect the middleweight division. But he can't make any demands when it comes to purse splits and who gets what percentage, who gets what type of percentage for the fight. See what happens. Can't wait to see if Golovkin's finally going to get his big fight. Or is it going to be the same old story? Fighters calling him out after he has fights signed, trying to swerve their way out of a fight with Golovkin and continue to use his name to promote their next fights. This is Boxing Truth. I'm out.